Throughout history, the ranks of royalty have never lacked scandalous figures. Princes and princesses whose lofty status seemed to grant them the freedom to indulge in every whim. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was one such figure. As the great-grandson of Queen Victoria and grandson of the infamously licentious King Edward VII, George seemed almost destined to court controversy. Born just a year into his grandfather's reign, he perfectly embodied the spirit of the Edwardian age, marked by its love of pleasure and luxury. Yet, he also came to personify its darker side of excess and debauchery. Even during his lifetime, whispers about his hedonistic lifestyle were rampant. His reputed indulgence in drugs, alcohol, and sexual escapades with both men and women led some to quip that he would not be safe in a taxi with anyone of either sex. These salacious rumors have clung to his legacy, persisting even 80 years after his untimely death. However, beyond the veil of scandal, there was another side to George. He was passionate about sports, had a love for sailing, and was fascinated by fast cars. When he married, he became a loving husband, and to his children, he was a devoted father. Yet, like many born into immense wealth and privilege, George grappled with a sense of aimlessness, struggling to find a purpose for his life. Initially, he joined the Royal Navy, following his father, King George V's wishes, but his true passion lay elsewhere. Eventually, he was allowed to pursue a career as a pilot in the Royal Air Force, a choice that would ultimately lead to disaster. Join me as I delve into the life, the rumors, and the tragic death of Prince George, Duke of Kent, to uncover the man behind the mystery, and stay tuned for more. Prince George of Wales was born at Sandringham on December 20th, 1902, to George, Prince of Wales, and Mary, Princess of Wales, more commonly known as Mary of Teck. George's father, also named George, was the second son of Bertie and Alex, who had become King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra just 1 year before George's birth. George spent his childhood years at York Cottage, on the grounds of Sandringham House. Despite the cottage's modest size and their growing family, George and Mary continued to live there after they became king and queen. By the time of Prince George's birth in 1902, they had 5 children: Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, and George. The youngest of the York children, Prince John, was born on July 12, 1905. His life was short and tragic. Born with epilepsy and developmental delays, John was often kept away from his siblings and the public. He died on January 18, 1919, at the age of 13. Like his elder brothers Albert and Edward, Prince George's education began at York Cottage, before he was sent to St. Peter's Court Preparatory School. George was considered the brightest of the York brothers, with his headmaster, Mr. Richardson, commending him for applying himself in every subject. However, George was not enthusiastic about following his brothers into the Royal Navy. Despite Queen Mary's attempts to spare him from naval college, King George V was determined that his son would continue the family tradition. Reluctantly, George, then only 13 years old, was sent off to the Junior Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight. When he first arrived at the Naval College, George seemed to settle in well, applying himself to his studies as he had always done. However, a mixture of boredom and perhaps melancholy soon set in, causing him to struggle with concentration, and his grades began to decline. Despite these challenges, he excelled at languages, and his proficiency was recognized when he was given duties as an interpreter in French. Yet George remained deeply unhappy at the Naval College and began writing to his father, pleading to be allowed to leave and pursue something he felt would be more constructive and meaningful. According to the autobiography of Mabel, Countess of Airlie, a lady-in-waiting and friend of Queen Mary, George confided in her during Royal Ascot about his dissatisfaction. He expressed his unhappiness in the Navy and his desire to enter the civil service or the Foreign Office, but his father, the king, was adamantly opposed to the idea. His only reason for refusing is that it had never been done before, George lamented. I've tried to make him see that I'm not cut out for the Navy, but it's no use. What can I do? The Countess advised George against arguing with the king, which would likely only provoke anger. Instead, she suggested he work hard while at sea, complete the civil service application, and then present the results to his father. Mabel's advice proved successful. Despite his academic success, George's severe digestive problems continued to undermine his health. A year later, after being promoted to the rank of commander, He was finally discharged from the Navy. Over the next 3 years, George became the first prince to work as a civil servant, joining the Foreign Office. However, he found his duties there undemanding and yearned to make a real impact. Like his elder brother Edward, George was deeply concerned about the plight of the working man and the unemployed, a pressing issue as unemployment had risen to more than 2 million. This concern led George to change departments within the civil service, eventually becoming a Home Office factory inspector. With the full approval of the King and Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, George officially joined the Home Office on April 12, 1932. George took to his new role with enthusiasm, quickly becoming a popular member of the factory inspectorate. After leaving the Royal Navy, he moved in with his brother Edward at York House, and the two brothers grew closer than ever. Reflecting on this period in his memoir, A King's Story, Edward wrote, "Although George was 8.5 years my junior, I found in his character qualities that were akin to my own. We became more than brothers. We became close friends." The two shared a similar sense of humor, a passion for fitness, a love of jazz, and a penchant for partying. Life at York House was vibrant and carefree, with Edward indulging in his favorite pastimes, shooting, hunting, and dancing the night away at London's fashionable nightclubs, often in the company of a succession of mistresses, each more controversial than the last. Like Edward, George was not only a partygoer but also developed a reputation as a playboy prince. He was often seen at nightclubs with Lady Alexandra Curzon and banking heiress Poppy Baring, and rumors swirled about his affairs with famous women like Gloria Swanson, Florence Mills, and Tallulah Bankhead. However, it was his relationship with someone far more scandalous that nearly brought him to ruin. Toward the end of the Roaring Twenties, George became involved with Alice Gwynn, better known as Kiki Preston, a stunning and wild figure associated with Kenya's infamous Happy Valley set. This group of wealthy, privileged aristocrats had settled in Kenya and were notorious for their decadent lifestyles. Kiki, whose past lovers included the legendary Rudolph Valentino, was infamously dubbed the girl with the silver syringe due to her drug use. It wasn't long before Kiki introduced George to heroin, morphine, and cocaine. The relationship spiraled, and rumors circulated that Edward, then Prince of Wales, had confronted Kiki after she suffered a miscarriage. Edward convinced her to leave England, determined to help his brother recover. He arranged for George to stay at a country estate where a qualified nursing staff could oversee his rehabilitation. Edward wrote to his mistress at the time, Frida Dudley Ward, "The cure has reached a rather tricky stage. I'm carrying out the work of doctor, jailer, and detective combined. The old saying boys will be boys is all right until you get too old and should know the form better. He seems to lack all sense of knowing what is so obviously the wrong thing to do." Drugs, however, were not George's only weakness. Throughout his life, his attraction to women was equally matched by his attraction to men. Among his rumored lovers were Anthony Blunt, a third cousin to the Queen, Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, and even the renowned writer Noel Coward. However, during that time, homosexuality was illegal and punishable by imprisonment. George's status as a prince afforded him a level of protection that his partners did not share. Still, the risk of scandal could have severely damaged both his reputation and that of the monarchy. This fear became a real concern towards the end of the 1920s, when George's carelessness led to compromising evidence being left behind. On one occasion, Buckingham Palace had to send 2 emissaries to Paris. Acting on the king's orders, they broke into the apartment of one of George's boyfriends to retrieve a gold box with a personal inscription on the lid, along with several incriminating letters. Although there are no specific sources detailing plans to find George a wife or indicating that he was pressured into marriage, it is likely that those close to him believed that a wife could provide stability, and at the very least, keep George out of trouble. Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark was born on December 13, 1906, as the youngest of 3 daughters of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark and Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna, who became known as Princess Nicholas. Her birth was difficult, leaving her mother fragile and unable to participate in public life for a time. Marina was born at Nicholas Palace in Athens, where her family lived in relative peace until the Greek Revolution disrupted their lives. Marina and her sisters, Olga and Elizabeth, were raised primarily by their nanny, Miss Kate Fox, who remained a trusted companion throughout their lives. Kate's unconventional methods, such as spoon-feeding the princesses chamomile tea, giving them sponge baths with cold seawater, and allowing them to play nearly naked in their garden were considered radical at the time. During her childhood, Marina traveled extensively with her family, visiting England, Finland, and Russia. On August 28th, just weeks after Germany declared war on Russia, Marina and her family said their final goodbyes to the Romanovs. In Greece, political instability led to King Constantine's forced abdication in 1917, and his son Alexander was installed as a puppet king. On July 4th of that year, Marina's family, including her uncle Prince Andrew and aunt Princess Andrew, left Athens for Switzerland, where they lived for 3 years before moving to Paris. Despite these changes, they continued to travel and maintain connections with European royalty. It was during a visit to the United Kingdom that Marina met the man who would become her husband. It is likely that George and Marina were not very familiar with each other when they first met, in 1933. Their initial encounter took place at a lunch party hosted by the society hostess Emerald Cunard, where they immediately hit it off and made plans to see each other again. While they established an instant rapport, the romance developed gradually, with George reportedly finding Marina bossy. However, this impression was not enough to dissuade him, and when Marina returned to England the following spring, George was among the first to visit her. During this stay, George and Marina spent considerable time together, going to the movies, dancing the night away at the Embassy Club on Bond Street, taking long, fast drives in George's sports car, or simply enjoying private walks in Green Park. As they spent more time together, their relationship deepened, and George became increasingly captivated by Marina. Speaking of her, he said, "She is the one woman with whom I could be happy to spend the rest of my life. We laugh at the same sort of thing. She beats me at most games and doesn't give a damn how fast I drive when I take her out in the car." Things came to a head in August 1934. Marina was staying with her family in Bohinj when Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, married to her sister Olga, invited George to join them. George, who had been enjoying the races at Cows Week, called Prince Paul to let him know he would be arriving soon. An experienced pilot, George borrowed an aircraft from his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, who had become the first of Britain's Royal Air pilots, and flew to join Marina. According to Prince Christopher's memoirs, the weather was perfect, and the next few days were spent shooting, fishing, exploring the woods, and having tea and lunch with Marina's father, Nicholas. One evening, after a late-night backgammon game had left everyone else too tired to stay awake, George and Marina found themselves alone. The very next day, George and Marina informed her family of their engagement. The news was met with delight by the King and Queen, who were vacationing at Balmoral at the time. On August 28th, the engagement was officially announced. In the weeks following the engagement announcement, the British public eagerly learned all they could about Princess Marina. She even gave an interview to the press in her parents' apartment in Paris, but surprised the reporters when she casually lit a cigarette in front of them. On September 15th, Prince George left Balmoral Castle, where he had been staying with his parents. The following day, Marina and her parents arrived in Folkestone from France. The enthusiastic reception she received from the crowds of well-wishers was later compared to the scenes that had unfolded when George's grandmother, Queen Alexandra, first arrived in England to marry the future King Edward VII. In celebration of his fourth son's upcoming wedding, King George V announced that he would revive a royal title that had disappeared with Queen Victoria's father. On October 12, 1934, Prince George was granted the titles of Duke of Kent, Earl of St. Andrews, and Baron Downpatrick. Thursday, November 29, 1934, was as damp, gray, and misty as the forecasters had predicted. Nevertheless, enormous crowds lined the royal route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, with some people hanging from windows and standing on rooftops for a better view. Once more than 2,000 guests had taken their seats inside Westminster Abbey, the royal family arrived. Marina, dressed by the Paris-based British couturier Edward Molyneux, who also designed for Greta Garbo, Gertrude Lawrence, and Vivian Leigh, looked stunning in a silver and white brocaded lame dress patterned with English roses. The gown had been crafted by a team of seamstresses, including Russian émigrés Marina insisted on employing. Her 12-foot train, lined with silver, flowed from her shoulders, and her tulle veil was held in place by a diamond-fringed tiara, a gift from the City of London. Marina was escorted up the aisle by her father, Prince Nicholas, and the ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the end of the service, the royal couple exited Westminster Abbey to the strains of Here Comes the Bride, with the crowds roaring and bells ringing. Upon returning to Buckingham Palace, George and Marina were married again in a Greek Orthodox ceremony. Family members showered them with rose petals and tiny silver horseshoes as they departed in an open carriage towards Paddington Station to begin their honeymoon. The 5-month honeymoon, culminating in a 12-week cruise, was so lavish and indulgent that it somewhat tested the popularity of the new Duke and Duchess. During their honeymoon, George and Marina unexpectedly developed a friendship with the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The President was visiting Nassau aboard Vincent Astor's yacht, Noormahal, and invited the Duke and Duchess to join him for lunch. They got along famously, and when they parted ways later that afternoon, President Roosevelt extended an invitation for George to visit him in Washington. George and Marina returned to England on April 14th and spent a few days at Windsor before moving into their new home at No. 3 Belgrave Square, which was leased to them by Lady Juliet Duff. They were given free rein to redecorate as they pleased, and it was at this residence that, on October 9, 1935, the Duchess of Kent gave birth to their first child, Prince Edward. 2 more children would follow: Princess Alexandra, born on Christmas Day, 1936, and Prince Michael of Kent, born on July 4, 1942. While George and Marina seemed to have settled comfortably into their marriage and family life, their peace would be short-lived. King George V had been in poor health for years, but the sudden death of his beloved sister, Princess Victoria, on December 3, 1935, was believed to have hastened his decline. He canceled the state opening of Parliament, and after his sister's funeral, he retired to Sandringham. King George V passed away on Monday, January 20th, 1936. When the affair between the new King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson became public, the scandalous American divorcee faced intense scrutiny and harassment. Though Wallis was widely reviled, George and Marina, whether due to their close bond with Edward or a desire to avoid judgment, initially took a liking to her. George and Marina were frequently entertained at the King's notorious country retreat, Fort Belvedere, and they often reciprocated by hosting Edward and Wallis at their own country home, the Coppins, in Buckinghamshire. However, their opinions of Wallis changed dramatically following the abdication crisis. George, furious over the scandal, once declared that he wanted to kill Mrs. Simpson. When Edward made his intention to abdicate clear, the resulting turmoil left his younger brother, the Duke of York, on the brink of a nervous collapse. For a time, the situation seemed so dire that George was even considered as a possible successor. Ultimately, however, Albert, affectionately known as Bertie, ascended the throne as King George VI. George had been perhaps the closest of the brothers to Edward, and considering the profound negative feelings the rest of the family harbored toward Wallis and Edward, George was likely the only one to feel truly distressed by his brother's departure. Edward and Wallis were married on June 3, 1937, in France. A few years after the abdication scandal, the Duke of Kent was officially invited by the King to become Governor-General of Australia. His appointment would have taken effect from November 1939, but global events changed their plans. On September 3rd, it was announced that Britain was once again at war with Germany. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, George grew tired of his menial work at the Admiralty and expressed a desire to do something that would really be useful to the country. The King agreed to his transfer to the Royal Air Force. Marina was also given a uniform and a position as Commandant of the Women's Royal Naval Service, although it was rumored she only accepted the position after some encouragement from Churchill himself. Marina's wartime efforts extended beyond the Royal Navy. At the onset of war, she offered her services to the Ivor, Denham, and Langley Cottage Hospital, where she, along with other local volunteers, made dressings, prepared splints, and helped with general tasks. Later, she worked at University College Hospital in central London as a nursing auxiliary. Despite the war, George and Marina made every effort to provide a stable family life for their children, to whom they were devoted. They were affectionate and doting parents to Edward and Alexandra, playing games, telling bedtime stories, and making sure to be home in time for tea after public engagements. Their third child, Prince Michael, was born on Saturday, July 4, 1942. The couple invited President Franklin D. Roosevelt to be the prince's godfather. On July 11, 1942, Roosevelt responded, "I am much thrilled and very proud to be godfather to the youngster, and I send him my affectionate greetings. Tell the Duchess that I count on seeing him as soon as the going is good." Prince Michael of Kent's christening took place on August 4th at Windsor Castle, with King George VI standing in for President Roosevelt. On the day of the service, the president sent a cable to George saying, "My affectionate regards to Michael George Charles Franklin. I am anxious to see him as soon as I can. Do send me his photograph. Tell the king that I will hold him to strict accountability until I am able to take over the responsibility of a godfather myself. My warm regards to you and the Duchess. Franklin D. Roosevelt." George and Marina, already devoted parents to their 2 children, Edward and Alexandra, must have felt elated with the arrival of their 3rd child. 6-year-old Prince Eddie, as his parents lovingly called him, was already taking after his father in many ways, sharing George's curiosity and interest in all things mechanical. Father and son often spent hours together tinkering in George's garage at the Coppins. It's easy to imagine George, a loving and dedicated father, excitedly wondering which traits his new son might inherit from him. Tragically, however, this was something George would never see. From the day of his son's christening on August 4th, 1942, Prince George, the Duke of Kent, had only 21 days to live. George was assigned a mission to Iceland to inspect RAF bases, marking the beginning of what was supposed to be a more active role in the war effort. His friendship with the Roosevelts and Nancy, Viscountess Astor, the first woman to sit as a member of the British Parliament, had fueled his ambitions to serve as a liaison officer between the American and British Air Forces. George's friend, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., then serving in the Navy, arranged a meeting between George and General Carl Toohey Spatz, commander of the 8th Air Force. It was Spatz who suggested that George fly to Iceland, where he would be invited to a U.S. base, and Spatz could then formally request George's services as a liaison officer between the British and American bases. On the afternoon of August 24th, George bid farewell to Marina before driving to London to board the train for Inverness, unaware that this journey would be his last. The following morning, George was introduced to his flying crew at RAF Invergordon. Leading the crew was Flight Lieutenant Frank Mackenzie Goyen of the Royal Air Force 228th Squadron. Acting as the first pilot was Wing Commander Thomas L. Mosley, the commanding officer of 228th Squadron, who had been temporarily attached to the flight crew as a courtesy to the Duke. The rest of the flight personnel, all personally selected by Mosley, included Pilot Officer Sidney Wood Smith as the second pilot, Pilot Officer George Saunder as the navigator, Flight Sergeant Charles Lewis, William Jones, Ernest Hewerdine, Sergeants Edward Blacklock, C. Arthur Catt, Leonard Sweet, and Sergeant Andrew Jack as the rear gunner. On August 25th, while the crew was being briefed, the Duke of Kent and his party had lunch with Group Captain Francis. At 12:30 p.m., they were ferried out to the aircraft by a marine tender. Once aboard the short S.25 Sunderland Mk3 flying boat, they spent the next half hour or so conducting routine pre-flight checks and warming up the engines for takeoff. Around 1 p.m., the Duke was welcomed on board. Minutes later, the Sunderland began to taxi across the water. The waters were so calm that the flying boat needed a long run to find a wave large enough to help it lift off. Low clouds and fog along the south coast of Caithness indicated poor flying conditions for the first part of the flight, but clear weather was expected once they reached the open Atlantic. At 1:10 p.m., the Sunderland was airborne, flying between 2 headlands at the mouth of Cromarty Firth, known as the Suitors, before turning northeast to follow the coastline. Hugh Morrison, who was rounding up his flock of sheep with his son in the east coast village of Berrydale, recounted hearing the aircraft flying overhead, though it was obscured by the thick Scottish fog known as Har. Suddenly, they were startled by the sound of an enormous explosion as the Sunderland crashed into a hillside, igniting 2,500 gallons of aviation fuel and sending a massive wall of flames skyward. Of the 15 men on board, only 1 survived. The lone survivor, Andrew Jack, had been in the rear turret, ironically considered the most dangerous place in the plane, which broke off upon impact, hurtling him to the ground and saving his life. It was widely believed that the aircraft had crashed into the 800-foot promontory on the Duke of Portland's Langwell estate, known as Eagles Rock, while others suggested that it cleared the summit but crashed into the rising ground beyond. However, for the Sunderland to have hit Eagles Rock, it would have needed to approach from a completely different direction. In reality, the plane had successfully cleared the 2,000-foot summit of Donald's Mount. For reasons that remain unexplained, the aircraft descended to an altitude of only 700 feet in thick mist and hazardous terrain, crashing directly into the sloping hill and exploding in a huge ball of fire. At the sound of the explosion, Hugh Morrison sprinted downhill and rode his motorcycle to the community of Braemore to sound the alarm, before continuing to the coastal village of Dunbeath to alert local physician Dr. Kennedy and the police. Later that afternoon, search parties, who had set out as soon as news of the crash spread, discovered the wreckage and bodies. Dr. Kennedy and 2 special constables, including William Bethune, hurried to the scene from Dunbeath. Both Kennedy and Bethune identified the Duke of Kent's body. Despite a large gash on his head, the Duke was instantly recognizable in his flying suit, but the inscription on his identity bracelet removed any doubt. It read, "His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent, the Coppins, Ivor, Buckinghamshire." The news of the Duke of Kent's death in a plane crash devastated his family and stunned the nation. Tributes poured in from across the globe, including a personal message to the widowed Duchess from President Roosevelt, who wrote, "I am shocked beyond measure at hearing of the tragic accident, and I want you to know that I feel the loss very deeply and personally. He has given his life for his nation and in a great cause. I am thinking much of you and the babies." George's death marked the first time a British royal had died in active service since King James IV was killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, over 450 years earlier. The King and Queen were at Balmoral when they received the news. The King noted, "It came as a great shock to me, and I had to break it to Elizabeth and Harry and Alice, who were staying with us. We left Balmoral in the evening for London." Though Queen Mary of Teck had a reputation for being distant and unemotional, she shared a close bond with George. In her diary, she wrote, "I could not believe it." Despite her own grief, she was more concerned for her daughter-in-law. "I must go to Marina tomorrow," she said. Visiting Marina the next morning, she found her in a state of deep sorrow, alternating between sobbing uncontrollably and staring blankly into space. The funeral of Prince George, Duke of Kent, took place on the morning of Saturday, August 29th, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Marina, supported by Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, was escorted to her place opposite the high altar. The cortege entered the chapel, the Duke's personal standard draped over the coffin, adorned with his Air Commodore's cap and a wreath of flowers Marina had cut from Prince George's garden herself and placed there. King George VI wrote in his diary, "I have attended very many family funerals in the chapel, but none have moved me in the same way." 3 weeks after the crash, on September 14th, the King drove from Balmoral to Berrydale to visit the site of his brother's death. By then, most of the wreckage had been cleared, but the scars left in the earth by the devastating impact remained. The King observed, "The ground for 200 yards long and 100 yards wide had been scored and scorched by its trail and by flame. It hit one side of the slope, turned over in the air, and slid down the other side on its back. The impact must have been terrific, as the aircraft, as an aircraft, was unrecognizable when found." The intensity of Marina's grief following her husband's death initially caused great concern within the royal family. Although King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Mary did their best to support her, Marina had never managed to form close bonds with the rest of the royals, and without her husband, her sense of isolation only deepened. Recognizing Marina's need for comfort, King George VI persuaded Prime Minister Winston Churchill to allow Marina's unpopular sister, Princess Paul, to visit her. With her sister's support, Marina slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy. Within 10 weeks of George's death, Marina donned her commandant's uniform to fulfill her first public engagement since her husband's passing. By the summer of 1944, Marina had become involved with several organizations that Prince George had supported. She became the patron of the Royal School for the Blind and the training ship Arethusa, a 4-mast naval frigate moored at Upnor on the River Medway in Kent. Later, she succeeded George as Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal West Kent Regiment, later the Queen's Regiment, whose battalion had served as a ceremonial guard of honor at Prince George's funeral, lining the west aisle of St. George's Chapel. Marina visited St. George's Chapel on December 20th, 1942, the day that would have been her husband's 40th birthday. At Windsor, she descended the staircase leading to George's vault and placed a wreath of clove carnations, his favorite flowers, on his coffin. After her husband's death, Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent, continued to play an active role in the royal family. She carried out her duties diligently and even undertook overseas goodwill tours on behalf of her husband's niece, Queen Elizabeth II. In 1957, Marina traveled to the Gold Coast, now Ghana, for its independence celebrations. Princess Marina passed away at Kensington Palace on August 27, 1968, with her 3 children by her side. Strange theories about George's tragic final flight began circulating soon after the crash and continue to persist to this day. Each member of the flight crew had been carefully selected for their navigation expertise, raising questions about how such a catastrophic failure could have occurred. One conspiracy theory suggested that George himself caused the crash by taking control of the plane, leading to the deaths of all but one of the crew. A darker theory proposed that the plane was sabotaged before takeoff because the Duke of Kent was allegedly a Nazi sympathizer, and that the flight to Iceland was a cover for a secret mission to Sweden, where he would negotiate peace with Germany. Regardless of whether one believes these theories, it is undeniable that there is a significant lack of information surrounding the crash. A court of inquiry was convened and held in private, with its findings read out in the House of Commons. However, the families of the 14 victims were not allowed to attend and struggled to uncover concrete details about what had caused the tragedy. It later emerged that all documentation related to the inquiry had mysteriously disappeared. Even more peculiar is the absence of public commemoration for George, the first British royal in over 400 years to die while actively serving in war. No statues were erected in his honor, no grand memorials established, no hospitals or institutions named after him, and no official royal biography was ever written. If George truly lived as scandalously as rumored, perhaps those in power preferred his memory to fade. Ironically, by attempting to silence stories about his controversial life, they have only fueled speculation and drawn more attention to him. While the efforts to airbrush George from history may seem successful on the surface, the suspicious handling of events following the crash has ensured that Prince George, Duke of Kent, will not be forgotten.